This morning we're going to try to take a look at 1 Samuel 20. Father Jonathan is at his grandmother's funeral, which was yesterday, so will be driving back from Arkansas today, so keep he and Hannah in your prayers. We're going to try and pick up where he left off, though. So you remember in 1 Samuel 19, in this kind of building drama between David and Saul, Saul tries to kill David twice. And each time, one of his own children actually allows David to escape. First Jonathan, and then Michal, his daughter. And so I just want to say just a couple things about Saul, and then we're going to jump into 1 Samuel 20. One of the interesting things I think about, many biblical texts, we can read them at different levels and benefit from all of them. So I want to take a look at three dimensions about Saul that we just want to kind of think about for a minute. First, there's a character element of Saul that we want to think about, I think, very carefully. Saul is a good example of what we used to call, and sometimes the word is still used, wrath. That is, Saul's relationship to David is driven by his own wrath. That is, Saul believes that David is attempting to supplant him as king, that David's sort of like a rival, that David is somehow scheming to knock him off the throne and replace him, when none of that's true at all, right? The real person who wants to remove Saul from the throne is not David, but God. So that's what's actually going on. But that's not what Saul thinks. And so Saul here is a good example of wrath, and wrath here means something very, very specific. Wrath doesn't mean just simply anger. Like, something happens and you get mad. The seventh person in a row cuts you off on Thomasville Road and you're filled with wrath. That's not it. Wrath here is a state where someone has moved from having like periodic bouts of anger to where now anger becomes their settled disposition. They don't have anger now and then. They are angry all the time. And this anger distorts their whole perception of the world and everything around them. Right? And so it's Saul's anger, it's Saul's wrath that kind of leads to his own paranoia. David goes out and is successful against the Syrians or the Philistines, right? And Saul immediately thinks, oh no, he's like working against me. Whenever David does anything that actually benefits the kingdom, Saul has become so wrathful and so paranoid that he believes this is David's latest effort in the replacement campaign. Okay? So that's one thing, wrath. In Ephesians 4, Paul says something really important about wrath that I think we want to just kind of think about in this case. It's Ephesians 4, 26 to 32. Here's what Paul says. He's giving general kind of advice about things, but he mentions wrath. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with everyone in need. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as good for building up, as fits the occasion. And that it may give grace to those here. That would be a good, law to govern, like social media, right? Only say what would actually build up. Okay, that'd be a great thing. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. And notice what Paul says. He says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Meaning, right, don't sort of save the anger so that it builds up into the next day and the next and the next and the next, because guess what happens, right? That's when you move from occasionally being angry to being wrathful, to anger as sort of like a settled disposition. And the second thing we want to notice about it, right? Notice this is not just like an individual thing. Notice it's not just saying, well, poor old Saul, he's wrathful, bad boy, he should have reformed his life. Too bad. Notice here, right, that wrath, the settled disposition of anger, Paul sees as a fundamental threat to communal and good relations among people. Right? Imagine a community, in this case, Paul's thinking about a church, right? Imagine a community or church, right, where in effect, like wrath has become sort of like a common, settled disposition, where everybody feels they have a bunch of grievances against everybody else, where everybody is sort of like suspicious of everyone else, where they sort of misperceive everything that's said. That's not a recipe for a healthy community. And then notice what else all Paul says. Don't let the sun go down on your anger and give the devil an opportunity. Guess who's an expert at using wrath and anger for his own advantage? To undermine communities, to destroy relationships, to set people against one another, to create division and animosity. That's what Paul's warning against. And we see it right here in the person of Saul. We'll see it in a dramatic way in just a minute in 1 Samuel 20, right? Where Saul now is going to move from wanting to kill David to he's going to actually attempt to kill his own son Jonathan. His mind is so gripped with wrath and anger, he's even willing to kill his own son. That's how bad things are. In effect, right, Saul now can really not be a real king. He's simply consumed with his own wrath, his own anger, his own paranoia, his own bitterness. And so there he is. A second sort of theme that we just want to kind of pay attention to here with Saul is it's a sort of general Old Testament theme about kings in general. As we go on and as we read in the rest of 1 Samuel and then 2 Samuel and then 1 and 2 Kings, right, one of the things we discover is that the good kings in Israel's history are like few and far between. The good ones really stand out because most of the other ones are like really bad. And they're bad at, in various ways. Some of them are scheming and devious. I'm thinking here of Jeroboam. Remember what happens when the kingdom splits right after Solomon's death and Jeroboam becomes king of the northern kingdom, and then Jeroboam is worried that everyone's going to kind of go to Jerusalem to worship in the temple, and that'll like undermine his authority. So remember what he does? He creates 2 golden calves so that people can worship them in the northern kingdom and they won't be going to the temple anymore, and therefore, right, they'll be all under his thumb. He literally creates idols in order to prop up his own authority as king. And then there are the kings, who marry a bunch of foreign princesses and, brings all these foreign princesses in, and they all bring their own religion in, and things go to pot from there. And then there are the kings who are just like plain bad. They're just like bad people. So the Old Testament here is kind of like warning us a little bit about kings in this sense, right? That while they occupy an important place, and while they have a very specific mission that God's given them, there's a sense in which we're not to put our full trust in them. Because they're human beings and they're likely to betray that trust at some point. That is, it's clear, right? And we can kind of see this now looking back. That was one of the points that the narrative of 1 Samuel wants to make, right, is that it's actually a really good thing that the future story of this story that's unfolding about the people of Israel, right, actually does not really depend on Saul, because if it did, this would be the end of it. Okay? There wouldn't be a story beyond this point. But it doesn't. So there's the possibility of the future. So there's a sense in which, right, we have to be sort of skeptical about kings, even ones that are sort of fairly good. You have to kind of keep things in perspective on them. And then a final thing that we want to just think about briefly is the theme of providence, God's providence. And I think this is a really important theme. The other thing that's very clear about 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings is that the chief actor in this drama isn't Saul, isn't David, isn't Samuel. The chief actor in this drama is God, who's always like the chief character, whether we see him or hear from him or not. Okay? Even when he is not seen, even when he doesn't speak, he's still at work doing things. So it's really important. And I think one of the things that sometimes, people will read like 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st and 2nd Kings, and they'll kind of like come away sort of like semi-depressed. Because they'll say, oh, wait, I read 1st Kings for the first time, and, it's filled with a bunch of nasty people. I was hoping to be like inspired. And it's like idolatry and adultery and, power games. And wait a minute, where's the inspiration here? The affirmation is that even in the midst of all these conflicting, difficult, and sometimes even sinful human relationships, God is at work, working out his purposes. And so there's an important point that's being made here about God's providence, right? God's providence does not mean that every time we look around us, we will be able to sort of clearly see exactly what's going on. Yes, I see it now. I see what's really happening. Yes, it's very clear. Or we shouldn't think, right, that because God's providence is at work, that somehow that means everything is sort of all neat and nice. Everything's working out, everyone's doing exactly what they're supposed to do, everyone's happy. This must be a sign that God's providence is at work. No. One quick example of that. Good Friday. Remember what Peter says in Acts 2? In that famous sermon of the day of Pentecost, remember what he tells the audience? He tells them that Jesus was handed over to be crucified by the definite foreknowledge and plan of God. Now, I doubt very seriously that anyone who was standing there watching Jesus being crucified on Good Friday was saying to themselves, oh, even though things look really bad, actually this is like really, really good. This is providence, folks. And that's when a revival breaks out and everybody starts talking about how lovely God's providence is. Or that didn't happen, right? But that doesn't mean that God's providence wasn't at work, because that's what Peter says, right? God's providence actually is the thing that's behind all this. This is how all this happened. Okay, let's take a quick look at 1 Samuel 20. I want to at least be able to report to Father Jonathan that we actually did do part of chapter 20, so I don't get in trouble with him. A couple things about 20 I think are really important to look at. And the first is right at the beginning of the chapter in 20, verse 1 and following. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" That is, I think what we want to see here, right, is we want to see, this is like a genuine question from David, right? Your father has tried to kill me twice. I was sitting at the table, and he threw a spear at me, hoping to impale me in the wall. Clearly, that's a sign that something's wrong, right? When someone throws a spear at you, hoping to impale you in the wall, that's a sign that things aren't quite right. And then remember, Saul sends his soldiers to David's house to literally pull him out of bed and drag him to Saul so that he can be killed. And so David's question here really is like an anguished question. What have I done? And the answer is nothing. You, David, have done nothing. Something's been done to you. And that is, God decided to have you anointed king in Saul's place. And that's why all this is happening. Once again, God's providence, right? I'm sure David at this point is kind of saying, hey, I'd like to see God's providence improved a bit. If God's providence means that the king is trying to kill you, I'd like to change this a bit. So it's a genuine question, and it's also, I think, an anguish question. And then Jonathan says this, and he said to him, far from it, you shall not die. This is Jonathan talking. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me, and why should my father hide this from me? It is not so. But David vowed again, crying, your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. Basically, David says, there's basically 5 inches between me and mortality at this moment. Well, they devise a plan by which Jonathan's going to find out Saul's true intentions about David, and Jonathan is going to convey that. But I want to notice a really important word here. The important word occurs in chapter 20, verse 14. David and Jonathan kind of make a covenant with one another, and this is where the important word occurs. If I'm still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord. This is Jonathan talking, by the way. He's talking to David. If I'm still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of his enemies of David from the face of the earth. So 2 things here that are really important. Thing number 1, notice, Jonathan knows and accepts that he, Jonathan, is not going to be Israel's next king. The reign of Saul and Saul's family or house is coming to an end. And Jonathan is not going to succeed his father. He realizes and recognizes that this is the will of God, and unlike his father, he accepts it. That's the first thing. The second thing here is this really important word that he uses, twice. The English translators render it here as steadfast love, but in Hebrew it's one word. It's the word hesed, H-E-S-E-D, usually pronounced with a hard H, so it almost comes out as chesed. It sounds like you're trying to cough something up. This is a really important word, and I want to say just a little bit about it because it is so important. Hesed here is kind of one of these interesting, Old Testament words, Hebrew words, that's really difficult to render into English. Because for us, right, the word love has been so sentimentalized and romanticized, right? When we hear the word love, right, we primarily think of a sentiment, right? If someone says, I love you, that means they have a certain set of feelings for you. Or if they say, I don't love you, that means they have a certain set of feelings for you as well, which you may not want them to have. But we sort of go on the assumption, right, that if anybody's talking about love, they're talking about a feeling or a sentiment or something like that. The word hesed actually has no emotional connotation whatsoever. It's not a feeling word or an emotional word. It's essentially an action word. So here's what it kind of means, something like this. To talk about hesed is to talk about someone's utterly faithful behavior and relationship with you. Now, obviously, the first and primary practitioner of hesed is God. That's why the word's so important, right? God's steadfast love, God's steadfast loving kindness, God's hesed to Israel is displayed in the fact that although his people are frequently disobedient, unfaithful, and ungrateful, he doesn't abandon them. And that's the kind of relationship now that we're seeing between David and Jonathan. David and Jonathan, in effect, have a relationship in which they practice loving kindness, faithful loving kindness to one another. And the pact essentially is this. Look, no matter what happens, you can always count on me. The only thing that's going to prevent me from keeping my promise to you is if somebody kills me. And so now we see this really important relationship developing between Jonathan and David that mirrors the relationship that God has to his people. Now, of course, as you probably know, later on in Ephesians 5, Paul's going to say that the hesed, the covenant-loving faithfulness of husband and wife, will mirror the relationship of Christ to the church. So, very similar thing, right? So that's the idea. So they're entering into this covenant. Now I want to finish by making a really important point. Toward the end of this chapter, Jonathan kind of is trying to defend David before his father Saul, demands to know what Saul's going to do, and Saul is like really angry about this. And this is what Saul says to Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20, verse 30. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore, send and bring him to me, that he may surely die." Then Jonathan answered Saul his father, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him. So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. That's a great, brilliant deduction on Jonathan's part. If he's willing to kill me, he's probably willing to kill David too, Once again, just a really quick point here. This goes back to our point about wrath. Another thing about wrath, right, is that it destroys relationships. And here we see it destroying one of the most fundamental relationships that there are, the relationship of father and son, and not only relationship of father and son, but relationship of king to heir. Saul is so consumed with his own anger that he's actually willing to kill his own heir after having engaged in a whole series of actions where his goal was actually to facilitate Jonathan's succeeding him. I've spent the last year ensuring you succeed me. Now I'm going to put you to death. It's a kind of wrath initiates us into sort of a pattern of like self-defeating behavior, right? And I think what we're being invited to do is we're being invited now to see something else. And that is, we're being invited to look at Saul not just simply as that bad king who can't get his act together and is filled with wrath and has like bad family relationships, too bad. We're being invited to think about us as Saul in relationship to God. rebellious, disagreeable, unfaithful, disobedient. There's a sense, right, in which I think the narrative is inviting us to sort of see ourselves in the person of Saul in terms of how we relate to God as sinners. As I think I've mentioned, this is where we'll stop. As I think I've mentioned before, Rembrandt painted the famous scene of the Stilling of the Storm. And if you look at Rembrandt's painting, it's very impressive, right? There's this huge storm, a little boat, the disciples in the boat. But if you count the figures, you'll notice that there are 14 men in the boat. There's the 12. There's Jesus, so that's 13. But then there's a 14th person in the boat. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the 14th person is Rembrandt himself. He's painted himself into the picture. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the look on his face is a look of sheer terror. That is, it's Rembrandt's way of saying, our normal approach to this painting, right, is to look at the painting, we see the disciples, and we say, those awful disciples were afraid in the storm because they didn't know that Jesus was going to still it, or something like that. And Rembrandt is reminding us, right, look, if you or I were in that boat, we'd be scared stiff too. And it's the same thing with Saul, right? There's a sense in which we probably can see something of ourselves in Saul. And there's kind of like a little warning light that goes off in that recognition. So, I'll tell Father Jonathan that we actually did a good part of 1 Samuel 20, and hopefully he'll be happy with me.